While I think it was a positive development, I still have yet to see concrete progress on denuclearization.
But this offer to bring inspectors into Yongbyon is new, and I hope that we can explore it.
If we're actually going to make progress towards denuclearization, we're going to have to get into a broader commitment.
North Korea's offer to dismantle Yongbyon facility hinges upon U.S. corresponding measures.
I see this as a purposeful negotiating strategy so that they can always ask for more, draw negotiations out.
I suspect that they're going to want some form of UN sanctions relief, peace declaration.
That has the potential, as we move forward, to inject even more turbulence into our alliance.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eunjung Cho. During the third Inter-Korean Summit, North Korea's pledge on shutting down a key nuclear facility came with a condition that U.S. takes unspecified corresponding measures. The State Department, in response, says nothing can happen in the absence of denuclearization. Today, we discuss whether the latest Inter-Korean Summit has moved the denuclearization process forward.
Making tremendous progress with respect to North Korea.
Now my guest today, Mr. Frank Jannuzi, president of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Also joining us today, Mr. Abraham Denmark, director of the Asia program at the Wilson Center. Mr. Denmark served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Thanks for having me.
Now, were there concrete progress on denuclearization in the third round of Inter-Korean Summit? And Chairman Kim also publicly reaffirmed his willingness to denuclearize, but didn't he already reaffirm many times before?
Yeah, there's statements about commitment towards denuclearization, but I have still yet to see any concrete signals that North Korea is genuinely interested in denuclearization. The clear but fairly vague requirement that the U.S. also take steps towards even making progress on denuclearization, to me, sends a signal that North Korea still sees this as part of a bargain, that they're not, at least at this point, willing to go as far as the United States would want them to go, as far as the international community wanted them to go. I still have yet to see concrete progress on denuclearization.
I had a slightly more optimistic take on it than Abe. I mean, I feel like this is the first time the North Koreans have really opened the door to U.S. inspectors sort of concretely talking about getting U.S. inspectors and monitors into their nuclear facilities. So we're beginning to see the outline of a roadmap of what the denuclearization process might look like. I mean, granted that for now the North Koreans haven't really done anything that would irreversibly set back their nuclear program. They're still producing fissile material, they're still producing plutonium. But this offer to bring inspectors into Yongbyon and suspend operations there under safeguards, under monitoring, is new. And I hope that we can explore it.
Well, my question there is, inspectors are invited to observe but not to monitor or verify, so that could be some kind of difference there. But also North Korea has started dismantling the Dongchangri missile facility already since July. Mm-hmm. So is North Korea just giving away some limited benefits and just try to create an appearance of progress?
Well, I'd be interested in Abe's take on it because he knows the military side of it better than I do. But I think that the steps so far, including on missiles, are very modest and have not really significantly affected North Korea's actual nuclear missile capabilities. But having said that, would we rather have the North Koreans building new facilities or dismantling old ones? I'd rather have them curtailing activities than starting new ones. So again, I think that we should not discount these steps by North Korea as somehow meaningless.
I agree with Frank that we shouldn't discount them, but we also shouldn't overestimate them. That these modest shutdowns that the North Koreans have announced, they do not affect North Korea's ability to produce these missiles or to produce those weapons. And there's no statement about North Korea's existing stockpile of ballistic missiles, of nuclear capabilities. And they're also very specific, very singular facilities that if we're actually going to make progress towards denuclearization, we're going to have to get far beyond individual facilities and get into a broader commitment with broader access to international inspectors about the entire enterprise, both on the nuclear enterprise and the missile enterprise.
Also, the United States wants the declaration list early on in the process to establish a verification regime. But it seems it's very evident in the Pyongyang declaration that North Korea keeps on avoiding giving this declaration list and just jumps directly to unilateral dismantlement. So what are the pitfalls in accepting this North Korean approach of unilateral dismantlement?
Well, the reason the United States, in my understanding, has wanted this declaration was to know what we're talking about. That we need a baseline before we begin the denuclearization process of knowing where their facilities are, where their weapons are, where the inspectors need to go, and then what kind of capabilities need to be shut down. That if North Korea says they have X number of weapons, then that means that further along in the process we need to verify the dismantlement of X number of weapons. But from the North Korean point of view, their concern, as I understand it, is that providing such a declaration would be providing in part a targeting list for the United States. And they say, how could we trust you with that information until we have a less hostile, more friendly relationship? So there's a fundamental disagreement between the two sides about how we move forward.
Yeah, that's right. The North views transparency as their enemy. There might be a middle ground open to the parties, however, which is to focus first on those facilities and capabilities that pose the greatest threat to the U.S. and South Korea, fissile material production, missile production, and then to move toward this complete inventory of the North's nuclear and missile facilities prior to full sanctions relief and full normalization. So there might be a staging that we could do, starting with the high priority items, even without the inventory, and then proceeding to tell the North Koreans, if you want further progress, you have to produce this complete declaration.
North Korea's offer to dismantle Yongbyon facility is conditional, hinges upon U.S. action of corresponding measures. So what do you think would be these corresponding measures?
North Korea has been very consistent in its insistence on having these vague conditions spelled out. They also talk about the need for the U.S. to end its hostile policy, which is also not clearly defined. Yes. And I think they do that very purposefully to give themselves maximum flexibility in negotiations so that they can always ask for more, draw negotiations out, and always be able to say the United States just hasn't done enough to justify North Korea moving further down to denuclearization. I see this as a purposeful negotiating strategy.
I think Pompeo is going to sort that out next week, maybe when he sits down with Ri Yong-ho. It's always hard to know exactly what the North Koreans have in mind, but clearly they're interested in sanctions relief. If there's going to be U.S. inspectors on the ground at Yongbyon, I suspect that they're going to want some form of UN sanctions relief. And also, they continue to press hard on the peace declaration.
President Trump and Secretary Pompeo quickly welcomed the Pyongyang declaration. Why do you think the U.S. government is out to move the diplomacy forward?
Well, I think there's clearly an interest in improving relations between North and South. And both Secretary Pompeo and President Trump have expressed an interest in improving those relationships, in supporting President Moon in that effort. But there's an inherent tension there that the U.S. Still also insists on denuclearization, that we're not going to be able to move forward on a lot of these issues outside of the nuclear realm until we make progress on the denuclearization piece.
I was surprised by the speed and the warmth of the Pompeo-Trump response to the North-South meeting. And I think this may be the first example of the good work of Steve Biegun, who was in the region coordinating U.S. policy with the allies in advance of the summit. I think the Trump administration was totally prepared for the summit results that were announced and had already essentially decided that they were going to greet that very warmly. Let's be honest, there's a political imperative here for the president. You know, he is looking to show momentum in the denuclearization process before November in the hopes that it may give Republicans and his own administration a little bit of a boost in terms of their public standing.
there was the speed and the warmth, but at the same time, President Trump and Secretary Pompeo mentioned nothing about offering any kind of concessions that North Korea wanted. Now, President Moon says that he will personally explain to President Trump when he meets with President next week about the denuclearization discussions. So why didn't the two leaders of the two Koreas just put them in the declaration, come to President Trump personally and explain what do you think?
Well, look, transparency and diplomacy don't always go hand in hand, and I think that there's a lot going on behind the scenes here that is being orchestrated by President Moon that he does not want to share in public. And I also believe that, as Abe pointed out, the North Koreans are pretty masterful about maintaining maximum negotiating flexibility. They're also not going to want to spell out precisely what they're offering in terms of denuclearization steps.
Now, Mr. Denmark, you were the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, so you have the expertise on this. How did you look at the military component of the joint statement to create a to expand the buffer zone and to create a no-fly zone? Wouldn't this impact the access to the grounds, training grounds by U.S. and RK military?
I'd have to look at some of the specifics of what a no-fly zone would look like. But in a more of a military sense, I am very supportive of efforts to reduce tension on the DMZ, to reduce the potential for crisis or conflict on the conventional level between North and South Korea. But I do have, the one concern I had about the declaration is the idea of a no-fly zone. Mostly that seemed a fairly one-sided concession in that the North Korean Air Force is not very active, as far as I know, and not terribly capable, at least compared to the U.S. and South Korean air capabilities. And so that seems to be a very one-sided aspect of the agreement. I'd want to see a bit more of an even bit of it, but broadly speaking, I think reducing military tension on the DMZ is a very good thing.
My last question, just briefly. So the latest Inter-Korean summit was all over the media, and Chairman Kim will also visit Seoul, and that will also be all over the media. Doesn't this entice people to believe that there are some kind of progress when there's no progress on denuclearization?
Well, appearances can mask reality, but they can also reveal something about the dynamic that is genuine. I think that atmosphere, mood, personal relationships, this is a part of international affairs. And to the extent that Kim Jong-un and President Moon are now trying to build some rapport and some ability to communicate with each other, I think that goes deeper than just propaganda.
And I would also add that these summits are not only about denuclearization. They're also about improving inter-Korean relations. And in that sense, I think the summits have been successful, that the relationship between North and South is in a better place today than it was 12 months ago.
We'll leave it here and watch video for our next topic.
That meeting will give the Secretary a chance to update the Security Council on our efforts toward the final, fully verified denuclearization of North Korea, as well as underscore the need for all member states to enforce existing sanctions.
Why, after voting for sanctions, is Russia now backing away from them? It's because Russia has been cheating.
The 73rd session of the UN General Assembly heads into high-level week. One of the key priorities for the United States is the denuclearization of North Korea. Secretary Pompeo will preside over a UN Security Council ministerial meeting on North Korea sanctions, and the Secretary also invited to meet with North Korean Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho. So the United States is pushing both pressure and diplomacy on North Korea at the United Nations. So what is the strategy here in this dual track of pressure and diplomacy?
Well, there were some very interesting media leaks of intelligence this week in Washington, where basically the administration is turning up the heat on Chinese and other nations that are participating in the smuggling of oil and coal in and out of North Korea. So it's pretty clear that the administration is frustrated by the failure of China in particular, but also Russia and other countries to strictly adhere to the UN sanctions regime. And the reason that they're frustrated is because this is the precise moment when they're trying to advance diplomacy with the North and they want maximum leverage and they don't have it. So for sure, I think Pompeo is going to really try to light a fire under the Chinese and Russian and other delegates in New York and impress upon them the importance of strict adherence to the UN sanctions.
We still will maintain sanctions through the United Nations, I believe, and that will still continue to have some degree of pressure, but in terms of maximizing North Korea's economic and political isolation, there's no chance that the United States will be able to do what it was able to do 12 months ago, when even China was very much on board with this idea of maximizing pressure.
Now, Abe just said that it's hard to maintain the maximum pressure, but wouldn't there be any new ways to encourage the UN member nations? You know, they are holding new Security Council meeting on this, so wouldn't there be new ways?
I feel like they're going to follow South Korea's lead, and Moon Jae-in is embarked upon this mission of improving North-South relations and reducing North Korea's isolation and building economic ties and leverage over North Korea. And other nations are going to pay more attention to that than they are to the verbiage of a UN Security Council resolution. The UN Security Council resolutions are only as powerful as the commitment of the member states to strictly enforce them.
U.S. government, for one, are calling out the violators of the UN sanctions, and Ambassador Nikki Haley said that this year U.S. military tracked at least 148 instances of illegal ship-to-ship transfers, which resulted 800,000 barrels of refined petroleum oil flowing into North Korea. So how is this breaching of UN sanctions helping North Korean economy keep afloat?
Well, it makes sure that North Korea continues to have access to these resources. The idea of pressure was to change the calculation in Pyongyang, that the pursuit of these missiles, these nuclear capabilities, are not worth the economic isolation. I'll be watching at the UN Security Council is when the United States and South Korea find themselves in different positions when it comes to pressure on North Korea, that the United States wants to enhance North Korea's isolation economically, just as South Korea is promoting economic ties and economic programs with President Moon bringing CEOs with him to Pyongyang. Yes. How willing is the United States to pursue pressure, even if it means injecting more turbulence into its alliance with South Korea? That's a critical question that I'll be watching at the UN General Assembly.
Last question. Now, South Korea and North Korea are seeking to reopen the Kaesong industrial complex and restart tours to Mount Kumdang. But isn't this a violation of UN sanctions? And what are U.S. concerns on this project?
That on one hand, Seoul wants to engage with North Korea, wants to enhance that relationship, and on the other hand, the United States wants to maintain that isolation in the pursuit of denuclearization. These two tracks of diplomacy will come into increasing competition with one another, injecting turbulence into our alliance, unless Seoul and Washington are able to navigate these issues or even potentially delink these issues and allow one to move more quickly than the other while maintaining some degree of pressure to maintain the other goal as well.
The only thing I wanted to add is that I'm not against Kaesong and Mount Kumgang projects, but let's be real. These are projects that the North Koreans surround with what I call mosquito netting, designed to basically limit the cultural pollution that comes out of the contact with the South for the rest of the North Korean society. And I think that we should be maximizing our effort to support the form of engagement that does not have mosquito netting around it.
We'll have to end it here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a picture from the 3rd Inter-Korean Summit. In this picture, South Korean President Moon, Chairman Kim, and their wives sit inside a cable car on the top of Mount Baekdu. Frank, what's your reaction?
Well, it's too bad they're not going skiing together, huh? It's awfully cozy and modern, and the wives are there. So, I mean, I think this says a lot about the efforts by North and South to portray the Korean people as one family.
I understand President Moon is an avid hiker, and I suspect that given his preferences, he'd prefer to hike up rather than take a ride up, but I suspect that Kim Jong-un probably wasn't up for that. So hitching a ride is probably a better idea for them.
I don't think so either.
Yeah.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Frank, Abe, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eunjang Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.